In my childhood, our village welcomed a beggar who was as thin as a rake, with blackened teeth and an unpleasant odor emanating from him. When he begged at our doorstep, my grandmother, moved by innate kindness, gave him a piece of bread. Holding the bread, the beggar issued a chilling prophecy. All pigs in the sty must be slaughtered to avoid the impending disaster. Our family's livelihood depended greatly on pig farming. The sale of pork and piglets brought us considerable income each year. My grandfather, practical and impatient with superstition, scoffed at the beggar's ominous warning. "Do you know how much a pig is worth? Nonsense! Get out of here!" He chased the beggar away from our home, sternly warning that it wouldn't just be a simple expulsion if he dared to return. Days later, my cousin George, the pride of our family and the only one pursuing higher education in the city, came home for the summer break. His arrival was a cause for celebration, and my grandfather decided to slaughter a pig for the occasion, inviting some people over to help. As they prepared to slaughter the sow, something unexpected happened. The sow suddenly began to give birth, revealing a piglet's tail. A shocked silence fell over the yard, and my grandfather's face showed confusion. Our neighbor, Mr. Wilson, questioned the decision to slaughter a pregnant sow, suggesting a mistake might have been made. My grandfather, puzzled and insistent, claimed he hadn't bred the sow. My grandmother quickly intervened, cutting the ties and urging, "Quick, bring her back to the sty to give birth." Together they managed to move the sow back to the sty. "You and your memory," my grandmother teased, despite my grandfather's stubborn refusal to admit his mistake. Mr. Wilson tried to lighten the mood, commenting that more piglets meant good fortune, hinting there could be 8 or even 10. Their casual chat filled the sty as they awaited the outcome of the birth. However, the birthing process seemed troubled. The piglets struggled to be born. My grandmother became anxious, using scissors to assist, while telling me, "Ben, go fetch a basin of hot water." I ran back to the house, where my cousin George was engrossed in his books. "Aren't you coming to see the piglets being born?" I asked. "What's there to see about piglets being born?" "I'm not going," he replied dismissively, reflecting his status as the family's intellectual. In the sty, my grandmother struggled to aid the sow's birthing, but the results were disheartening. The first piglet was born incomplete, its body gruesomely severed. My grandmother was shocked. "What's happening?" My grandfather joined her, inspecting the malformed piglet, while Aunt Lee lamented the loss. The subsequent births were equally horrifying, each piglet more deformed than the last, as if mauled by an unseen predator. Just when we thought the nightmare was over, the sow let out a piercing scream, announcing the birth of another piglet, much larger than the others. My grandmother gripped the piglet's legs, slowly pulling it out. To our horror, its head bore a disturbing resemblance to a human face, covered in fine black fuzz. My grandmother stood up, her voice filled with fear. What is this?" My grandfather, pale-faced, attempted to rationalize. "It's just a deformed piglet, nothing to worry about." Amidst the unease, I hurriedly fetched George, urging him to see the monstrosity for himself. His response was immediate and decisive: "Kill it." This request marked a rare break from his usually composed demeanor, sparking a flurry of activity and chaos in the sty. Debates and disputes over the piglet's fate ensued, with undercurrents of fear and superstition threatening to overwhelm the rationality and pride that had long defined our family. My cousin, a man of books, usually mild-mannered and rarely prone to outbursts, shocked everyone in the sty with his sudden roar. My grandfather, confused, asked, "George, what are you saying?" George, my cousin, whom we affectionately called Joe, glared with angry red eyes, scanning the surroundings, and demanded, "Give me a knife, get me a knife." My grandfather firmly grasped his arm, sternly questioning, "What are you trying to do? Have you lost your mind?" From my grandfather's tone, it was clear that if George continued his antics, he might actually take action. George calmed down slightly under my grandfather's stern gaze. Seeing the situation turning sour, the others in the sty began to leave, laughing off the tense moment. My grandmother, with an apologetic smile, said, "Sorry for the trouble. We'll make it up to you next time we slaughter a pig." Her idea of compensation was offering a few pounds of pork as a token of gratitude. After they left, only the four of us remained in the sty. My grandfather released George, not without scolding. "What madness got into you with so many people around?" George firmly replied, "I'm not mad. That deformed piglet should be killed. Do you really want to keep it?" The malformed piglet, though grotesquely shaped, was clearly still breathing. If brought inside and cared for a few days, it might survive. My grandmother placed the malformed piglet beside the sow, allowing it to nurse. But the already weak sow, upon seeing the deformed piglet, stood up, retreated to a corner, and let out a pitiful howl. This sound triggered panic among the other pigs in the sty. They seemed terrified of the malformed piglet, with some sows even jumping out of their pens. My grandfather cursed, "What in the world is going on?" George scoffed, "See, even the sow is afraid of it. It should be killed." My grandmother examined the malformed piglet carefully, and I too moved closer. Just then, George suddenly snatched the piglet from my grandmother's hands and threw it to the ground, resulting in a loud thump. Blood flowed from underneath the piglet, some splashing onto George's face. He smiled. "There, all settled now." Before my grandparents could react, George had already run out of the sty. My grandfather, frowning deeply, chased after him, while my grandmother hurriedly followed, saying, "Let's talk this out. Don't lay hands on him." I was left alone in the sty, witnessing a deformed piglet for the first time in my life. I couldn't help but lean in closer, noticing its head resembled a human's, and its front limbs were like human arms, its hooves curled like 5 fingers. As I reached out to touch it, the piglet suddenly opened its eyes, revealing a sinister smile. It seemed it wasn't dead. Terrified, I ran out. "Grandfather, grandmother, the piglet seems to be alive." Entering the house, I saw George, his face flushed from a recent slap. My grandfather, Frank, sat on an old wooden bench smoking a pipe, silent for a while before slowly speaking. "Did you really not do this?" George, emotionally charged, loudly responded, "Of course not. I'm a human, not a beast." Tears welled up in his eyes, showing his hurt before he ran to another part of the house. Our home was not small, with 2 buildings front and back. My grandmother, Alice, sitting on an old kitchen chair, frowned at me. "What's not dead?" I replied, "The deformed piglet, it's still alive. It can even smile." She didn't believe me, stood up and said, "Nonsense." Despite my fear, I followed her back to the sty. Upon arrival, the deformed piglet was gone. Only a pool of blood remained. My grandmother sensed an ominous sign, loudly calling me, "Ben, go get your grandfather." After saying this, she picked up a broom from the ground, cautiously scanning the area as if searching for the piglet. I rushed out, calling loudly, "Grandfather, grandmother needs you. Quickly come to the sty." Grandfather hurried out from the house, joining me back at the sty. "What happened?" Grandmother turned to him, gravely saying, "The deformed piglet is missing. We need to search." They searched the sty with brooms in hand but found no trace of the piglet. Grandfather speculated, could a weasel have taken it? Grandmother didn't reply, her gaze fixed on every corner of the sty. After several fruitless minutes, Grandfather finally said, "Let's forget it and make dinner." Grandmother put down her broom, agreeing, "All right, I'll start cooking. You clean up the sty." Grandfather nodded, beginning to tidy up, while grandmother and I walked out of the sty together. During dinner, grandmother had prepared the meal and asked me to call George. His room door was locked, and he didn't respond to my knocks, clearly still upset. Grandfather said, "Ben, come eat. Leave him. Let him be hungry." Grandmother nudged grandfather, signaling him to stop. She gently called, "George, come eat. Hurry." The door remained closed, unresponsive. Grandmother sighed, scooping a bowl of food from the pot. "I've left the food in the pot for you. Come eat if you're hungry." Grandfather then picked up a bottle of wine, taking a sip, impatiently saying, "Forget about him. Let's eat." Late at night, I suddenly felt a stomach ache and needed to use the toilet. I carefully got up, put on my shoes. Grandmother woke up, asking, "What are you doing?" I replied, "Going to the toilet." She softly instructed, "Put on a coat before you go out." She fell back asleep, while grandfather's snoring continued. I quietly opened the door to the outer room and found it was left open. Perhaps grandmother forgot to lock it. I rushed to the toilet. Just as I was about to leave, I heard noises from the sty, not like fighting or normal pig sounds, but more like mating. Hastily finishing up, I saw George walking out of the sty, looking pleased. I was about to call him when I noticed his shadow appeared as a standing, walking pig. This sight chilled me to the bone. I instinctively covered my mouth. Just then, George turned, noticing me. He asked, "What are you doing?" My eyes fixed on George's shadow, which now returned to a normal human shape. I wondered if I had seen wrong. Seeing I didn't respond, George said, "Why are you out here so late? Come here." I approached, telling him I had just been to the toilet. Before I could finish, George suddenly leaned in, asking in a cold tone, "What did you see just now?" I felt uneasy, unsure why. Instinctively wanting to retreat, I was grabbed tightly by George. He roared, "What did you see?" In the moonlight, I saw George's shadow transform into the standing pig again. Terrified, I was about to scream when I heard my grandfather's voice from inside. "Ben, aren't you coming back to sleep?" George seemed startled by grandfather's voice too. I took the chance to break free and hurried back inside. I closed the door, leaning against it, my forehead covered in cold sweat. Grandmother turned on the light, concerned. "Ben, what's wrong?" I curled up on the bed, shaking. Grandmother asked worriedly, "What happened? Talk to me." She pulled back the blanket covering my head, and I stammered, I was at the toilet. I saw George. His shadow. It was a standing pig. Immediately, grandfather kicked me, angrily saying, "Stop talking nonsense." I felt deeply wronged. I'm not lying. It was really a pig's shadow. Grandfather raised his hand, looking like he was about to hit me. I quickly hid behind grandmother, avoiding the blow. Grandfather glared at me, sternly warning, "If you talk nonsense again, see if I don't beat you to death. Go to sleep." Grandmother frowned, softly comforting me. "The child might have seen wrong. It's nothing serious. Why are you so angry?" Grandfather turned off the light, grumpily saying, "In the entire village, only our George has made something of himself, gone to university. How many people are envious? If this gets out, who knows how it'll be twisted, smearing George." Grandmother didn't respond, seemingly agreeing with grandfather. After a while, she gently patted my back, comforting me. "Ben, we can't talk about this. Go to sleep." Grandfather and grandmother didn't believe me. I even started doubting myself. Did I really see wrong? But George's behavior just then was too strange, not at all like him. The next morning, I was woken by grandmother's crying. I put on my shoes and ran outside. The yard was crowded with people gathered in a circle. I squeezed through, Seeing George, he was dead. Half his head was bitten off, his legs severely damaged, his death terribly gruesome. The villagers said George had fallen into the pigsty and was bitten to death by the pigs. Yet I had seen him just last night.